Anything else on those two verses? Okay. Let's move on. So we are going to move into the widow category, if you would. And let's go ahead and read verses 3 through 8, if I could get a volunteer. 3 through 8, 1 Timothy 5.
Honor widows who are truly widows. But if a widow has children or grandchildren, then they should learn to be godly first with their own family. They should repay what they owe to their grandparents, because this is acceptable before God. The widow who is truly a widow and who is all alone has put her hope in God. Day and night she continues praying and asking God for help. But the widow who lives for pleasure has already died while she is still living. Give these orders so that they will not be accused. If a man does not support his relatives, and especially his own family, he shows that he does not believe. He is worse than an unbeliever.
Okay, so we've got a whole lot going on here in these few verses, and we are going to skip over verse 3 for now. We will come back to it. But in verse 4 through 8, what do we see?
Family first.
Family first. Good. That's very good. I like that. And with family first, and we'll go all the way down there to that part. What if family isn't first? That's one of our questions as well, but sort of. Yeah. They have denied the faith, and it's worse than if they didn't believe at all. It's kind of scary, isn't it? It's a scary thing that if you don't take care of the widow in your family, that you are worse than an unbeliever. It's a scary thing to be in front of the living God and have to account for why you didn't take care of your family. Anything else? What else in that section?
I have a question.
Yes.
Is there any circumstance that it would be justifiable to not care for your elderly family? For example, they live in sin, they are unrepentant, they're weak, where do we...
Where's the line? So the question was, is there a point in which we are not obligated to take care of our family? Cynthia, you got it.
Sometimes we can help people better by not helping them than by helping them. So if we judge that would be the case, it's my opinion that helping them isn't helping them, so we shouldn't help them.
Enabling would be a good. It's kind of one of those things. If you give money to an addict and they just turn around and use that for their addiction, are you helping them? That's a tough question. I don't know that I would be comfortable answering that. But I have my opinion. I would say that I agree with Cynthia. I think there would be circumstances. I think they'd be few and far between. But I think there would be circumstances in which, like Cynthia said, maybe helping them is not helping them, if that makes sense.
I was thinking, I know of a circumstance where the parents were physically and emotionally abusive to the children and are still, even as adults, and they've put their distance between them in their adult lives, but now they're older and trying to take care of them, and it's very difficult because they're just so mean and evil.
Yeah, and I do think this kind of goes back to a very basic standard of living, maybe. Maybe not so much. It doesn't have to be monetarily, but just kind of, I think, making sure they're supported in a way that helps. If that makes sense, Glenn?
I was going to make a very similar point. You know, it's not about giving them cash, but providing for their basic necessities, that they have food, they have a place to stay. And I think that he's saying that if it's your family, your direct, lineage, right? He says parents, grandparents. He doesn't say, your cousins or even your brothers and sisters. He's saying your direct family, those who provided for you when you were a child, and you weren't that great either. Make sure they've got what they need. They didn't have Social Security and all the things that we have today, and in most cases today, there aren't going to be those people. If they've got money to spend on drugs, and their basic necessities have been taken care of, whether they choose to to eat the food that the government can provide. You can't force them to eat, but you're making sure that there is something that they can live on. They're not going to die because they can't find food. If they choose not to eat food, that's they're not a 2-year-old, and you've got to force them
everything,
to sit at the table and eat. But as long as then you've done your part.
Yeah. Anything else on that? Yeah, Cynthia?
Well, it also connects with verse 16.
Mm-hmm.
The church should not be burdened with taking care of your families. Maybe individuals can offer to help, but it's not a job of the congregation.
Yeah, and we'll get into that a little more.
Yeah, I was just going to make the observation when Jesus, had his little interaction with the Pharisees, and how that they were, basically saying what was Corban, in other words, dedicated to the temple. They didn't have to take care of their parents. And the fifth commandment is honor your father and your mother. Okay, now, does that mean you only honor them when they're nice people? And I don't believe that's the case. And it goes to, I think, what Glenn was saying. That doesn't mean that you facilitate their bad behavior, but if they are in dire straits, they need to at least have the basic provisions of life that is provided to them. And I think children have that responsibility to do that, even though they may have a grudge against their parents. Because, they did bring you into the world, and you do have life, and as Glenn pointed out, when we were little children, perhaps we weren't as what we ought to have been. I know in rebellious stages when you're teenagers, they still take care of you. So it is a conundrum, I think, but nonetheless, I do believe that there is inherent within the concept of honoring your father and your mother that you take care of them even if they are in positions where they are, just sorry individuals who brought you up in a way that they were abusive to you and all that kind of stuff. Well, it could very well be that you might be able to win them over to the Lord by the way you live your life, showing them that I do not appreciate what you did bringing me up. I don't appreciate the behavior that you're engaged in right now, but I am going to do what I can to take care of you.
Yeah, and I think more than anything, verse 4 tells us why we should do this as well. And what's it say? Very end of it.
Please God.
Hmm?
To please God.
It pleases God. And is that not what we as Christians are set to do? We're supposed to be pleasing to God. And at least that's what I'm striving to do. I would assume that everybody else is. We're trying to please the Lord. And in this part of honoring our father and mother is taking care of our widowed parents. And that is pleasing in the sight of God. Anything else in this on the part of taking care of our parents there?
Just one other observation I want to make. You know, there's that principle over in Romans chapter 12, where Paul makes the point, well, again, let me back up and say this, that if children are not taking care of their parents who have been basically worthless parents, what is the motive behind that? Is it vengeance? You know, you have to determine what it is. And I do believe that there is this principle that Paul makes clear that if your enemy is hungry, you feed him. If he's thirsty, you give him something to drink. Because by doing that, you're heaping burning coals upon his head. And I think the principle there would also apply when you're in a kind of a tenuous situation with your parents. You may perceive them as being enemies. Well, you still have a responsibility when they are in need to do what you can to help them out. And in so doing, you never know. You might win them over to the Lord. So that would be another observation I would make.
Yeah, and I think in verse, which verse is this? Verse 6, verse 5 talks about the truly widows or widows indeed, but then it moves on to verse 6, and it says, "But she who is self-indulgent is dead even while she lives. Command these things as well, so that they may not be without reproach." What does that mean? Who are these people who are self-indulgent and are dead even while she lives? Dave?
I think you might be talking about those who have a tendency to take advantage of other people's generosity.
Okay.
Or maybe even that of the church. You know, there are those who maybe have family, or they're estranged from family, or maybe they don't, but, you know, the church has always had open arms and hearts for helping people, and there are folks within the congregations, wherever they might exist, who are willing to help. And some people, you know, hate to say it like this, but it's kind of like the bum on the side of the street says, "We'll work for food," and you give him money and he goes to do something self-pleasurable. And so their motivation isn't in serving God. Their motivation for seeking care and sustenance and whatever it is in serving self.
Yeah, a lot of what I read about these verses is this was part of the false teaching that was going on there. These false teachers were coming in and say, well, the law says to honor your father and mother. It says to make sure you take care of it. And so no matter what, you're doing that. No matter, and it was talking about, it might have been monetarily mostly, and saying that no matter what, you do this. This was the false teaching, and saying that this is something that is in the old law, and therefore it trumps everything else that has been said. And I think, and the whole thing I've read is that this is Paul correcting this in these sections. It's Paul correcting this because it was going on where Timothy was, and giving Timothy a guideline to go off of, just as he did for elders and deacons. And any thoughts on any of that? Okay, Cynthia?
It is tempting for Christians to spend all their time and energy in charitable works and not have enough resources for spiritual works. You know, charitable works are very personally rewarding and make you feel good and help others, and it's a very concrete thing. You can check off a list.
Yep.
But it's very easy to get overwhelmed by that.
And just all of your focus being on that and not on some of the things that we should be doing as well. All right. Let's move into the next section. And this does include verse 3, I believe, and also verse 5. But who wants to read verse 9 through 16? Anybody? I guess I can read it. Tom, will you read that?
9 through 16.
9 through 16.
Let a widow be enrolled if she is not less than 60 years of age, having been the wife of one husband, and having a reputation for good works. If she has brought up children, has shown hospitality, has washed the feet of the saints, has cared for the afflicted, and has devoted herself to every good work. But refuse to enroll younger widows, for when their passions draw them away from Christ, they desire to marry, and so incur condemnation for having abandoned their former faith. Besides that, they learn to be idlers, going about from house to house, and not only idlers, but also gossips and busybodies, saying what they should not. So I would have younger widows marry, bear children, manage their households, and give the adversary no occasion for slander, for some have already strayed after Satan. If any believing woman has relatives who are widows, let her care for them. Let the church not be burdened, so that it may take care of those who are truly widows.
Okay, so some versions say widows indeed. What are widows indeed? What are the qualifications? Yes.
Be a widow that doesn't have any family.
Okay, so truly that's what a widow indeed, or truly a widow is, someone who has no family to take care of them, like we just talked about. Widows with families, they are not truly widows in the sense that they have no one to take care of them. So what are some qualifications then, outside of no one to take care of them? 60 years or older. So that was a point in time in their culture that they are, well, no good to society anymore. They are we'll just say they're a burden on society at that point in their culture, right? Because obviously women over 60 are very good for our congregation here in this culture. I know, right? Just grab that shovel and just keep digging. So I'm going to stop there. What else? Yeah.
They really don't have the means to support themselves.
Okay. No means to support themselves.
They had to wash the saints' feet and do good works.
Okay. So what all does that mean? Okay, I like that. Doing what you can to help others. Being a servant, right? We see when Jesus washed the disciples' feet, he didn't come to be served, but he came to serve. And that is, I think, exactly what it's talking about. Widows who are serving. They have a servant's heart, if you will. What else?
Wife of one husband.
Okay, the wife of one husband. Different things I've read. It could mean truly the wife of one husband, or faithful to their husband. Different ideas there, but I think conveying the same thing, being faithful to one man. What else? Lodged strangers, being hospitable. What else? Devoted to good works, yep. And I think in certain versions it talks about diligently following every good work. And in my mind, I guess when I see that word diligently, I don't think of, well, from time to time they're doing this. I guess, and not just for widows, but just all of us, when we think about being diligent in good works, it's not a one-off. It's one of those things that you can look at this person and know that they are full of good works, that their fruit is being bore where they are, but they're diligently seeking these good works. And we may have said it, but and have relieved the afflicted. So someone who's caring, who is about doing what God wants. And I think we can go back up to verse 3 and talk about honor these widows. Honor these widows who are truly widows. And so that is something for the church to do. We're to honor them. And part of that honor would be monetarily. And we'll kind of get into that a little bit later as well in this chapter. But and then verse 5 says, "She who is truly a widow, left all alone, has set her hope on God and continues in supplications and prayers night and day." This person in which we are to support is to be fully devoted to God. And I think that's what all of these qualifications are getting to, but that is her sole purpose. The kids in OSH are talking about Samuel and how Hannah gave Samuel over to the Lord, and how he was to devote his life to God, and it just got, I thought that coincided really nicely with this, because that's what these widows indeed are to do, is to wholly support or wholly put their life to God and devote their life to the things of God and to prayers and supplications night and day. Yeah.
And I think also in her pleas for help, asking God for help, we actually become the answers through God for her help in assisting her. So, she's continually, when she directs her ask for help, it goes to God, and then from God it works through us to come to her assistance.
Yeah, because you think about it, this woman is all alone. She has no family whatsoever outside of the church. And that, at that point, is our responsibility. Because would we not feel that kind of responsibility for really anyone else who's all alone? We would have that compulsion in this part to make sure that we take care of this widow indeed, this woman who's truly a widow. Anything else on widows indeed? Okay, so let's move on to just straight plain widows. Those who are younger, those who are younger. Let's stop there. What about them? What does Paul say about them and things? Let's go to the negative side. What are the negative aspects that these women can get into?
I think if anyone in their youth has been handed a bunch of money and has no responsibility and feels no responsibility to work, we tend to get into trouble.
Yeah.
And Paul is instructing the church here not to enable younger people, younger women in this case, to take on a commitment that they're not yet ready to take on. And really, they need to be busy doing the things that God has laid out for the woman to do. That's his plan for her, to grow into an older woman that's being honored here.
And just because this is talking about widows at this point, because the culture in which they lived, this dominated their culture. I think now, just in general, everyone should be striving after God. It should be striving to not go on the negative side of these things. But this is talking about widows especially, because you think about the men would go off to war and they would get killed that way. The men were the ones working. They were the only ones working at this point. they were doing the main share of the work and bringing home the money and things like that. And so these widows would be left, pretty much these younger widows who may not have had children at the time would be left to try and make a living other ways as well. And some things I read, they would go and do other things to get money, and this is telling these women, or telling them not to do things like that. Make sure that you're not running after immorality or anything like that. Cynthia?
Also, I think this might tie into the philosophies that are still around in some cultures, that marriage is bad and sex is bad, and that like you would be disloyal to your first husband if you remarried. Some people still feel like that, and that would be a temptation.
Yeah, and a lot of what I read was talking about that, and talking about how this false teaching had come in, and they were saying and like we talked about last week, there's a Greek philosophy that all matter, or all beings in this world, are inherently evil, as far as everything is evil. And so, but if you remember from chapter 4, Paul said that everything is given from God, and so everything is good. But we talked about, just because it's good doesn't mean it's used for a good purpose. And that's the same type thing we see here, is these women were maybe by false teachers told, well, you just need to figure it out, and because you are not going to be faithful to your first husband if you go and remarry, and if you do other things. And Paul kind of squashes that here. But what are some other things that these widows get into when they're younger? Maybe not as much wisdom, right?
Idle and gossiping.
Idle and gossiping. It talks about busybodies, right? Can you imagine what that would entail? It's just kind of going from house to house. And one thing that I'd read was the house to house was going from church to church, stirring up trouble, and trying to be taken care of, church hopping, if you will. But what's the saying? Idle hands is the devil's workshop. It's very true, isn't it? When we are not going about the Lord's work, that's when we start getting into trouble. And when we have our minds focused on God, when we have our minds focused on what it should be focused on, we tend to focus on those things, right? And other things don't creep in as much as they would otherwise. And so, and being a slanderer or a gossip, that's mentioned other places as well. So that's something that is to be watched in this circumstance. Anything else on the negative side of these widows? I think we've pretty much covered everything there. Let's move on to the yeah, Eric.
I was just gonna make a quick comment. I don't know that anybody would feel this way, but in verse 11 and 12, the young women feeling sensual desires is not what incurs condemnation. That's normal and natural.
Mm-hmm.
Rather, it's the commitment that they would make as a part of being supported by the church that they would then break because they want to get married now. That's what brings condemnation.
Yeah, and one thing I also read was in this day and time, if they were to remarry, they took on the religion of their husband, and so I think there is a warning here for Christian widows to make sure you are following what God wants, and not just to remarry and just in turn take on the religion of your husband, because he can be an heir, and we see that in other places as well. Is be that example, even for an unbelieving husband or wife, be that example, so that one day you might win them over. All right. So what on the positive? What are these younger widows to do? We've kind of already covered it. Oh,
Encourage them to remarry,
okay.
to have families, and to provide them opportunities and opportunities and even suggestions on ways that they could find somebody.
Yeah, and that is to not give way to what Allison said. Not give way to this slander. Not give way to the gossip. And because she is busy doing what she's supposed to be doing, and that is being married, having children, taking care of her household, and not giving the adversary an occasion for slander. And it talks about, for some have already strayed after Satan, and so it's talking about don't be like the ones who have already strayed.
Cody,
Yes.
maybe, this isn't just the opposite of being idle, having stuff to do at home,
Mhm.
laundry and all of that to stay busy. Rather, it's a very high calling, and you called it managing the household, and there's so much involved in that, especially when children are involved, in raising godly Christians. There's a high calling here, and I think it's reflected in the fact that widows, that were widows indeed, having done those things, are being honored in a very special way in God's plan.
Yeah, and I have not had to do it, but I appreciate every woman in here who has raised children, godly children, who are now raising their own children, and respect every woman who is currently raising their children, because that is not an easy thing to do. And we may kind of flippantly go over, well, they just bear children and do this. And like to Eric's point, this is the highest calling for a woman, and to go through that's a very hard thing, I know, to do. And I think all of us men can appreciate what a lot of the women do, and managing the household is much more than, like Eric's saying, it's much more than just doing the dishes or doing the laundry and things like that. It's there's so much more to it, and if you don't know what that involves, go to someone's house and help them, and you may see that there's a lot more to it. Okay, and then in verse 16, we go back to the making sure that these relatives take care of these widows. Okay, we've only got like 5 or 6 minutes, so let's talk about elders. I'll just go ahead and read it. We'll read 17 through the end of the chapter. Let the elders who rule well be considered worthy of double honor, especially those who labor in preaching and teaching. For the scripture says, "You shall not muzzle an ox when it treads out the grain, and the laborer deserves his wages. Do not admit a charge against an elder except on the evidence of 2 or 3 witnesses. As those who persist in sin, rebuke them in the presence of all, so that the rest may stand in fear. In the presence of God and of Christ Jesus and of the elect angels, I charge you to keep these rules without prejudging, doing nothing from partiality. Do not be hasty in the laying on of hands, nor take part in the sins of others. Keep yourself pure. No longer drink only water, but use a little wine for the sake of your stomach and your frequent ailments. The sins of some men are conspicuous, going before them to judgment, but the sins of others appear later. So also good works are conspicuous, and even those that are not common remain hidden. Cannot remain hidden. Excuse me. All right, so what are we talking about? So we've got these elders and he's telling Timothy to do what?
Well, that it's all right to provide physical support for elders. 1 Corinthians 9, the first half of the chapter, is all about that.
Yep. I was going to go there, but Cynthia went there. So first part of 1 Corinthians 9 talks about that as well. And it talks about a double honor. And I think it can go back to these widows. Does that mean they get, you figure out what you paid this, or gave to this widow indeed, and you say, well, we're just going to double that for the elder? Is that what that means? David?
I'd say no.
Okay.
And the reason for that, the way I read this, the double honor is there's the qualifications that a man must meet in order to be an elder. And then there's the work that he volunteers for in that, in terms of serving in that role. Because Jesus talks about teachers receiving a harsher judgment, right? So it's one thing to be qualified. It's another thing, and on all Christians should be quote unquote qualified, right? We should live to
Right.
those standards. But then to carry those standards and the banner for whoever is under your leadership, and you are, essentially responsible for the feeding of more in terms of the gospel of Christ and raising them spiritually, I think he's pointing that out, that you have the man, and then you have the man's service, and each of those kind of contain themselves, but
Yeah.
they're together.
And are to be honored, each one, and that's where the double honor, not to say that they deserve twice as much as I don't think that's what it's talking about at all. It's talking about those who serve as elders and are out teaching and preaching to those who need it. What else? Paul brings in a saying of Jesus, and I think at this point we can see that he already sees, and that is the laborer deserves his wages, and this is already seen as scripture in this time, especially by Paul, he's using the words of Jesus to justify this as well, and saying, and again, this kind of goes back to the false teaching that may have been coming in here, saying, well, you can't do that. You're not to pay these people and get this done. And Paul is telling him, well, give them what they're due, especially in what this double honor in which they are doing here. And then we have kind of a last thing for Timothy, I think, completely dealing with false teaching that has been entering the church as well. He's telling Timothy to make sure that you don't take part in which these sins, and what's supposed to be done with an elder to bring before the church. What's supposed to be done? I didn't say that very well, but David?
Well, if you have a man who's already fulfilled, again, the scriptural qualifications, and one of those is to be above reproach, then just because some individual has an issue with them, that's not going to be a disqualification. This needs to be something that has been witnessed by multiple people, something that would bring reproach upon the office of the elder or of the church, the body of Christ itself. And one person can't qualify that, just as it was in the old law, that God gave to Moses, is, a person couldn't be convicted but for the account of witnesses. And so when you have an individual dispute, you need to settle those individually. But if such an act has brought reproach upon the church and others have witnessed this, then the church needs to take action.
Yeah. And what's church to do?
Say that again?
What is the church to do? Rebuke them privately? Publicly, right? In front of everyone. And this is to be something that the other elders are to see and fear, right? It's to make sure, it's to keep them in check as well, and make sure that they stay on course. And the last part is, don't think that the sins that you commit are going to stay hidden. And vice versa, the good works that you do are going to come out as well eventually. And so, so just make sure that we keep that in mind, that both sins and good works will eventually come out, and people will know. But thank you so much for your participation, and we will be on chapter 6 next week. There are questions in the back, so thank you.